Is the branch made the host right now? Back as host. So back again. Yes. So we were talking about how LLP came into picture. LLP is a positive combination. It's a hybrid of the Companies Act's specialties versus your partnerships freedom. That's how it has been intended to do, and that's how it's been working right now. The act came somewhere in 2008, and from there on, we have been successfully using LLPs. So what happens in terms of an LLP is that the main difference between a partnership to an LLP is that the limited liability on the partners. Other than just the limited liability on partners and other things, it also becomes an artificial person. It also has a separate legal entity. So due to all this, there is an significant advantage which it gains over partnership. So when you take an organization for the purpose of obtaining loans and other things, it looks like there is insignificant difficulty in obtaining the loan if it's a partnership form. Whereas if you take it as an LLP or a corporate, then the benefits are much more easier and the banks are recognizing it much more effectively. So that being the case, LLPs is a corporatization of the firm. It has given a beautiful hybrid version. The only thing that is difficult in terms of unlimited liability partnership is if a partnership firm partners are not so very comfortable in terms of compliances, then LLP or a company becomes a bit more difficult to handle because of the requirement of ROC coming in. There are a lot of compliances, there are a lot of forms which needs to be looked at. So companies, yes, all of us are much aware of what is companies. It's a corporate entity, legal entity by itself. Uh, Legal entity by itself. We have to register a company. Once we register, we can register it either as a private limited or a public limited company. You can also register as an one. There are options of one-person company. If the sole proprietor wants to have a corporate shield to himself, then we can take it up as a one-person company, or we can start a small-sized company, which can be a partnership company. I mean, it can be a private limited company, and going on from there on, we can look at the different structures. It is an artificial person. There's transferability of shares available. All these are basic fundamentals that we know about companies. So we'll go into the topic for the day, which is the comparison between all the three. So once we look at what are the prevailing laws, then we clearly have to look into three different laws. One is a Partnership Act of 1932. LLP is covered under the LLP Act of 2008, and Companies Act is covered under Companies Act of 2013. One advantage of a partnership is that we don't need to revisit the provisions or revisit the amendments. There's not much. There's no amendments as such. Very rarely, I don't have much heard much of an amendment under the Partnership Act. But once you step into a corporate world, both LLPs as well as Companies Act, there are frequent amendments and regulations and rules which are being placed. We must be in compliance with all those rules and regulations. So that's the prevailing law part of it. We must know where and how to look into it. Registration requirements. A Partnership Act need not be registered. A partnership need not be registered. It is not mandatory to register a partnership. That's why I said it's an easy, quick way to start a business. You have the stamp paper, required stamp paper. Just put the deed across and then start the activity. You can start the partnership. Is that easy? Whereas in terms of an LLP as well as companies, you are prepared to take a registration. For registration, you have to apply towards ROC. The ROC, based on its approval formats, will create or will allow you to create an entity which stands by itself as a separate entity. And once the entity is created and incorporation certificate is issued by the ROC, then only the activity can start. So there will be a time frame which is needed to start an activity as LLP versus and company. That which is not there under a partnership. So since these are formulated through through corporate structures, creation under a partnership is only through a contract. It's only an understanding between two people coming together. Whereas what happens in terms of an LLP and a company, as I explained, is that it is created under law. So you have to go take the registration upfront. Once the registration process is completed, then only an entity comes into the picture. So that is the basic fundamental that we need to know. So anything relating to an LLP or a company, you may be needing something as close to 15 to 20 days to incorporate. You can incorporate it much quicker, provided you have all the basic details with you, or and the director has his DIN and other requirements. Other than that, general time frame that we generally tell our clients for formation of a company would be as much as 15 to 20 days is what we look at. You can create it much earlier, but considering the requirements, considering the director's requirements, we take a buffer and we say at least 15 to 20 days is the time frame which is needed to incorporate a company. Please feel free to stop me at any time and ask any question. You can just I don't think we can ask a question through voice, but you can, I think, pin your questions. We'll be able to take up the questions as frequently as possible. So going into the minimum number and the maximum numbers which is allowed. In a partnership, that is the main restriction that we are having as on date. You need minimum of 2 and a maximum of, in many cases it's 20. In certain cases of banking, I think is restricted to 10. Whereas when it comes to LLP, the minimum 2 remains, but the maximum is not restricted. So you can have any number of members under an LLP. And the benefit of an LLP is you can have a combination of or entity or persons coming together to start an LLP also, which may not be the case in terms of a partnership form. It may not work in those scenarios. Company, you have restrictions in number of persons. That means to say you start with 2. If it's a public limited company, you start with 7. Whereas in terms of the maximum number, for a private limited company, you are restricting it to 200. Whereas for a public limited company, it is not restricted. So that's how the distinctions happen. Why do we need to look at the numbers of personnel who are going to be involved? Is because the main fundamental reason of starting an organization is to look at the control over the organization as well as the return from that particular organization. So if there are more number of persons involved, then the preferable option is always to go into an LLP or a company. Whereas if it's going to be a restricted transaction, restricted activity, then obviously you will prefer to go into a partnership form. So that's how it starts. So legal proceedings, once registered partnership, you have a registered partnership, that entity can sue a third party. If it's not a registered partnership, then that is not possible. That all that you can do is to look at the partners taking it on behalf of the partnership firm. When it comes to LLP and company, as I explained earlier, both are separate legal entities by themselves. Since they are legal entities by themselves, they can act suo motu. That means to say through the hands of the directors and directors and the partners, designated partners, the LLP or the company will start acting on its own. It can take action against any person. So once you have a separate entity formed for the purpose of a statute, then it takes a significant step in terms of all other activities relating to growth and development. So that's how LLPs and companies have an upper hand as compared to partnership firms. Cost of formation, as I explained earlier, in a partnership firm, it's only the stamp duty, with stamp paper which is needed. We have a designated stamp paper. I think 5,000 rupees as of now. If you have that, then straight away you can start and partnership firm, not much of an issue. Whereas when it comes to an LLP, right now it's not only the stamp duty we looked into, it's also the ROC charges. It is competitive. It is much cheaper than a company formation of a company. It varies some from 600, 700 rupees based on the capital and other structures, and it can go up to 5,000, 6,000 also. Whereas in terms of a company, it's a bit more costlier affair to register a company. It's all linked to the authorized capital, as you all know. So once it is linked to the authorized capital, the higher the authorized capital, higher the ROC fees. So the monitoring of all these activity will be very, very need of the hour. And that is why I said at the start of a business organization itself, we should understand whether we need to set up an LLP or a company, because it becomes much more easier for us to formulate the whole structure. When it comes to the documentation, as we all know, partnership comes into with the partnership deed. Is partnership deed mandatory? Obviously, yes, it's mandatory. It gives us the benefit, and any entity which is formed newly for the purpose of PAN, TAN, GSTN, and all other things, we will be giving only this document as a proof for formation. So, partnership deed, which will mention about the partners' details, which will mention about the business of the organization, what would be the capital structure, what could be the terms of return in terms of salary, commission, or interest, and also in terms of the share of profits. More importantly, talking about the share of profits, all these put together is in a format is a partnership deed. Similar structure is also there. It's an LLP agreement in LLP, which also covers all these predominant activity. And based on all this only, the operations are created and certificate of incorporation things are granted by ROC. And in terms of a company, it is the memorandum and articles of association. So these are the fundamental documents. Like you all know that memorandum and articles becomes the approval. Without that, we cannot change, because on creation of a particular organization or a company, we have taken the shareholders' permission, and for that we have formed one memorandum and articles. Any change thereon, we have to go only to the shareholders for their approval. Based on their approval, we can even take it forward for rectification. Whereas in terms of a partnership deed, in terms of an LLP, the designated partners, if they decide to change it, amongst them, if they have a deed, revised deed or an upgradation of the deed, that can be taken into. So that will not be a difficult activity. Whereas in terms of a company, it becomes a very, very important activity that we check the data and ensure that all the compliances are taken. Formalities for incorporation for a partnership deed, we just need a form and affidavit. If you are registering it, you can pay the registration fee and then file it. So that's the basic part of it. But as LLP and companies come into picture, I have explained that we have to go to the ROC for taking the registration details. So every time we go to ROC, those many times we have to look at the correct area of rectification, and once we go to ROC, every time there is an ROC fee which has to be paid. Same thing is there in terms of any other it has to you have to pay the, but not necessarily need to be registered. So this is something that we talking much about really clear how the partnership works. In an LLP, the designated partners handle on behalf of the LLP as such. In terms of a company, again, we know that there are two sets of or member or two sets of people who are under the sets. One is called as the director set, other is called as the members or the shareholders. So shareholders predominantly be the investors, whereas the directors are the person who actually look into the day-to-day operation of the organization. So that's how the organizations go. So directors becomes the agents of the company, and they are not the agents of the members. They don't have anything on behalf of the members, but they talk on behalf of the company. Why? Because the company is a stand-off legal entity by themselves. So that's how it is looked at. Transferability of interest, a partner can transfer his interest subject to the partnership agreements, as I told you. If there's an admission and other things, or any share of interest to be given, it's based on the partnership agreement. Similarly, for LLP also, we can do it, and in terms of a company also, it is freely possible to do it as per section 56. That is, transmission of data as a shareholder is much more easier. When you're looking at the compliance activity from now on, the other activities are the compliance activity, which is more strenuous in terms of an LLP and higher steps in terms of a company. But obviously, that is for the benefits of the organization, and it cannot be looked as a standalone disadvantage. Whether there is any statutory meetings required, technically for a partnership entity, there may be not there's no necessity to have a partners meeting limited. Partners meeting, it need not be limited. They need not have partners meeting also. As long as things are going on fine, they may not require statutory meeting as per the as LLP also. LLP is a perfect hybrid between the partnership versus the company. It takes many an advantage of the partnership. It gives the corporate shield as a company and gives it to you as one model. Whereas for a company, yes, minimum we have to have 4 board meetings in a year at the gap of 120 days time frame. Anyway, for COVID season, I think MCA has come out with a circular which says that it gives us additional 60 days to conduct the board meeting, so that so as of now, for the first quarter and second quarter of the present financial year, which is 2021 financial year, we won't be looking at 120 days as the time frame for gap between 2 board meetings. We'll be looking at something like 180 days for the first 2 board meetings. After that, only based on the pandemic situation, we will again, if any advantage or disadvantages comes in, we will look at. So these are the minimum requirements. We should have at least 4 board meetings. If there are various committees which are required to be formulated by a Companies Act, those committees must minimum adhere to the number of meetings, like a CSR committee, or whenever if there's something like a nomination remuneration committee, then to that extent, every time an appointment of a director or anyone comes in, or key manager or person comes in, the committee must have met, and the minutes of the committee must be documented. So these are the various committees which will be needed. Other than all this, obviously you must also have once in a year an annual general meeting, an AGM, where the shareholders meet. Other than once a year meeting, if you want to meet the shareholders for any other purpose, then it becomes an extraordinary general meeting, an EGM. These EGMs also should be formally documented and completed. So statutory meeting wise, partnership versus LLP, not much of a significant change, whereas company will be required to give you a detailed requirement. Similarly, for a one-person company or a small company, there are certain benefits which has been given under the Companies Act. For a one-person company, there's no need to have a partnership meeting. Whereas in one person, a small company can have only 2 meetings instead of the capital structure and the turnover of an organization. We can look at some shelters which Companies Act has given us, but other than that, it still makes it mandatory to have 4 board meetings, 1 AGM in a year. So that becomes the key area when it comes to running a company, documentation of an organization, that becomes a forefront. Then audit requirements, obviously, if we are a partnership audit. If the partnership deed insists on an audit, then yes, audit is mandatory. Other than that, there may be some other act which is mandating and requirement for audit, something like an income tax act or a GST act. Those requirements coming in, then it is audit under those specific acts, whereas partnership act per se does not insist on any audit as a mandatory requirement. When it comes to LLP, there is a cap which has been fixed based on the capital and the turnover. It's 25 lakhs and 40 lakhs respectively. If you breach that limit, then it's an audit is mandatory. Until then, audit is not mandatory. That's what the Act says. When it comes to Companies Act, we all know there's a mandatory requirement that we have to have an audit. It's a mandatory requirement under the Companies Act. Which is registered as company under the Companies Act is mandated to have an audit, irrespective of its size and nature. So that is one additional feature of security which the company and the shareholders get in terms of the overall structure of operating the organization as compared to an LLP or a partnership. The next we go on to the voting rights. Again, voting rights predominantly in a partnership form depends on the deed, the agreement. Sometimes, majority of the times, it is in the same proportion of the partnership partner profit sharing ratio. In many a times, it may not be, but in some cases, if they insist that the person who is investing should have the higher say and the person who is not looking at the investments may not have a say, that also is possible to formulate, but technically it is in the same percentage as the profit sharing ratio. When it comes to LLP, voting right is decided as per the LLP agreement, very similar to a partnership deed. The LLP agreement is there. The LLP agreement also will look at the same requirement. In many games, it again becomes the same ratio of sharing the profits as per the profit sharing ratio. The voting right will be very similar to that of the profit sharing ratio. When it comes to companies, the voting rights is decided based on the shares. Again, 90% or 95% of the time when we formulate a company, we always say there's no disparity in the voting. But you can formulate a different kind of structures. You can have different voting rights given. That is also possible. You can have different paid up capitals based on the paid up capital, based on the face value of shares. You can have different voting rights given to the shareholders. And once the voting rights are different, then to that extent, every time you call for certain resolutions, if it is a general, then it's not a problem. If it's for getting to one class of shareholders, then you should also ensure that the other class of shareholders are not disturbed. So that is also something that we need to look into. Then when you're looking at the partnership remuneration, you're looking at partnership remuneration as such. Every working partner of a firm can take remuneration from the firm. Again, is there any restriction? Majority of the times when we start formulating a partnership act, we emphasize that the partner's remuneration is synchronized to that of the Income Tax Act. Why this is required is because anyway the partner's remuneration is disallowed for the purpose of EGBP. Based on that only, we give the it becomes an allowable expenditure. So in balance amount in the hands of the company is the firm is not allowed as an expenditure. So it doesn't get the shield of expenditure, doesn't get the tax shield. So many a times or most of the times when we always formulate a partnership deed, we always say that it is synchronized to the Income Tax Act, based on which we restrict the partner's salary, allowable salary as per the Income Tax Act, so that it gets allowed at both places. Other than this, a partner can also get a share of interest for his capital contribution. Again, amount is not restricted, but Income Tax Act obviously restricts the percentage to 12. So again, based on that, we also, whenever we formulate a partnership deed, we say yes, 12% is the most appropriate rate for giving. We can also give a commission to a partner based on the transactions, so that is also possible. When it comes to LLP, remuneration to the partner depends on the LLP agreement. Again, here also it's like partnership. We can take the same benefit and give it to them. Whereas when it comes to a company, there is a bit of a difference. The amount is fixed and it is more or less a regular payment, unlike a partnership or an LLP. That means you say, if the partnership is doing well today, I can draw as much as I want, and to that extent I can account it as a remuneration. Balance can be shown as drawings. Whereas in terms of a company, that's not possible. We look at the requirements of the caps. If it's a loss-making entity, then we have obviously the restrictions coming in. But anyway, for a private limited company, that is not there. The cap restriction under Section 197 is not there, because Section 197 as such is not applicable to a private limited company. So that being the case, we don't look at the cap requirements there. Other than that, yes, you have a fixed remuneration. What else is the way of pulling out the money? If the person who's investing is also the person who's working for the company, that means to say the director is also the shareholder, then for the return on investment, you either get it back as dividend, or if you have invested the money as loan on behalf of the company, or loan to the company, or granted a loan to the company, obviously you can take the interest percentage. So how different is the three? You have remunerations in all three. In partnership firm, if there's a fixed as well as fluctuating capital, the fluctuating capital is more like a loan granted to the firm. Then the low interest is calculated on that value and given to the partners. Similarly, here, if the shareholders are granted any loan to the company, then to that extent they are eligible to get a interest on that value, and obviously the return, you get a dividend in terms of a company. Whereas in other two, you can get a share of profits. That is also possible. So then, looking at the annual filing, again, since Partnership Act is not such a stringent act, it does not have any forms which needs to be filed. Whereas in LLP, that's where the difference starts stepping in between an LLP versus a partnership. You are mandated to file at least 2 returns, minimum of 2 returns, which is the account statement and the solvency annual return. Account statement and the annual return, which is required to be filed. These 2 are mandated forms, and if these forms are not filed within the due dates, then to that extent there would be a penalty for non-filing of forms. So this, I had a very bitter experience when I initially started with the LLP and all. I'm talking about somewhere in 2010, 2011, where we incorporated and track on the required time, and whenever we went to him for asking for information, he said he will give it now, he will give it in a time frame, but it didn't come, and we kept informing that there could be a penalty and other things. Unfortunately, when the details came and we started filing the information, we had to pay a heavy price. Almost 1.5 lakhs was the interest which was charged, penalty which was charged for non-filing of the 2 forms. We always had a delay of 6-7 months. So it became a heavy cost. From that time, I decided that LLP is a good no-no, unless and otherwise the partners or the designated partners are sure to have a full-fledged accounts personnel who can handle the overall structure. Other than that, if it's the partners themselves are handling the whole thing, then I said it's either partnership or we go to companies, nothing in between. Whereas if it's a mid-sized organization which has a good accounts team or who has one person who at least can coordinate in terms of form filing, then LLP is a very good option. It's a very good blend between the two. Companies Act, there are quite a few forms. I will be discussing on some of these forms towards the end of my presentation also. Yes, we have to file regular forms. Any change, any updation, anything which has been decided by the board, anything which has been decided by the shareholders, we have to file various forms. Any charge creation, all those also picks up a form. Any auditor's appointment picks up a form. A cost auditor's appointment picks up a form. So there are too many forms based on the need of what kind of structure it is. Based on that we could look at. The next requirement is of FDI. I've tried to bring in all possible combinations. A foreign direct investment is not permitted under a partnership act. You cannot have a foreign direct investment. So if you have any person who is coming, who is a non-resident or who is not a citizen of India, and who wants to enter into a partnership with some person whom we know here in India, then strict no-no for partnership. We cannot do that. FEMA is pretty strong these days, and the penalty under FEMA is also very, very stringent these days. So please take care of it. Whereas for an LLP and a company, yes, you can have investments coming in, provided it is at the it is approved by RBI. Again, under FEMA, we have two options. One is under the automatic route, and the other is under the approval route. If there's a restriction, you can, as long as it's legally transacted value, you are bringing it through authorized dealer. Formation, bringing in the money is not much of an issue. Whereas there are certain sectors which is having sectorial caps. If those caps are there, then to that extent, you cannot bring in money beyond that particular cap value. That is, foreign direct investments cannot be beyond the sectorial cap. Other than that, there is no restriction. It becomes gives a free requirement for us to start a particular organization as LLP or a firm. Then we look at the compromises, arrangements, mergers, demergers. Obviously, in a partnership firm, all that is not possible. We have to dissolve the firm, start a new entity. That's how it operates. But it can operate under the same name and other structures. But other than that, it's not possible. Whereas in LLP, I'll go to companies. A company is beautifully formed. You can do any kind of mergers, demergers. You can have compromises coming in, amalgamations happening. All these are very much possible. And LLPs beautifully take the shield of a company in this scenario. And since it is possible, it is possible to have a merger, demerger also under an LLP Act. So that is the benefit that LLP takes over partnership. It takes the complete best possibility of the company's benefits, seeps into the LLP. Then we look at the credit worthiness requirements. Obviously, when it looks at credit worthiness, for a firm, it depends on the goodwill and the credit worthiness of the firm. If it's a long-lasting firm and the partners are reliable persons, then the firm gets a credibility. Whereas in terms of LLPs, again, they enjoy the benefits of the partnership firm as well as the company. And hence that is there. Since they have a separate legal entity by themselves, they can have a higher credit worthiness than a partnership firm. For a company, because it's monitored under a law very stringently, the credit worthiness is a bit on the higher side and compared to a partnership and an LLP. So that's how it is to be looked at. Segregations to be looked at. Whistleblowing facility not available under a partnership. Yes, under LLP, under a Companies Act. Yes. What is a whistleblowing activity? It's an if there's any issues, someone wants to escalate the issues to the higher order. That is possible under an LLP or a company. Say, for example, three partners are there in an LLP. Three designated partners are there. Two of them are unaware of a particular activity. One partner is doing some fraudulent activity. One of the employee wants to inform the other two. Then that is possible under an LLP. Here also in a partnership firm, it's possible, but there's nothing, no such provision available under the Act. And how stringently will it be monitored and all is not clear. Whereas LLP as well as company, it is definitely possible to look at these kind of combinations. Differences that I wanted to capture. The next few slides again will be only on the basic requirements here. For starting an LLP, as I told you, it is not that easy. It cannot be done on a day's time. It takes time. You have to take the DIN in terms of a designated partner identification number. Then you have to get the digital signature. Anyway, digital signature has become mandatory for all purposes now, even in terms of GST, income tax for a partnership firm. We are looking at DSC, so that's nothing new. But under an LLP, obviously, you have to get the approval for the name, you have to get the approval for the documentation. What is the fundamental agreement? The LLP agreement has to be vetted. It has to be submitted to ROC. Based on the acceptance, obviously, you will have the execution and the stamping of the documents. Based on all this, an incorporation documents are submitted to ROC. And once that is there, they give an incorporation certificate. Then we can commence the business under an LLP. So this is what would be the time-consuming activity when it comes to creation of a particular limited liability partnership. Other than this, it becomes much more easier. Once you cross this initial hurdle, then it becomes much more easier. Similarly, when it comes to a company, obviously you look at the company, you look at the director as the person who's taking it forward. You don't look at the members. So we start with the DIN for the directors, DSC for the directors, then we obtain the name. We go for the name approval. Once the name is approved, then we look at the other requirement forms, which is nothing but your memorandum and articles. Now there is the incorporation form is much more easier. In one single form, you give all the details. You get the company registered, you get the PAN, you get the GST, and everything is linked. So ease of doing business has been formulated in such a way that in many terms we don't need to struggle at each location. It is one single slot and everything happens at that particular single slot. Then we look at the execution on the stamping of documents. That is also the need of the hour. And based on these documentations, we file the forms to ROC. Once we file the form to the ROC, they come up with the incorporation certificate. Once the incorporation certificate is given, from there on, commencement of business happens. Till that, commencement of business will not happen. So that's how the differentiation comes in. So hope I have made myself clear in terms of the distinction between the three entities as well as starting of new entity in terms of a company and an LLP. Okay. So now I'm trying to capture the different tax benefits which can be looked at for income tax for the three entities. Looking at the tax rates at present, obviously the partnership firms and LLPs are unfortunately being taxed at 30% right now, and you also have a surcharge of 12% if the net income is more than 1 crore. So that is the starting point for taxation. Whereas companies right now are having a bit lower tax rate. You have actually three different rates at present. You have one rate called 30, which is upfront. You want deductions, but you're going with the full rate. Yes, you can go up a flat rate of 30. You can also look at a rate of 25 percentage, which is a reduced rate based on the turnover structures. That is also there right now. Here also we have the surcharge and cess which is coming in, which is beyond 1 crore. But again, the surcharge here has a different slab rate. If it is up to 1 crore to 10 crores, then we have around 7%, and beyond 10 crores, it comes to 12. That distinction is not there in a partnership firm. So what unfortunately is happening at present is that partnership firms are getting a higher tax rate, whereas a company will be having a lower tax rate at present. Obviously, I think the finance minister will come up with changing this change in rates sooner, but we'll have to look at it. Going further, I'm sure all of you are aware of the amendments which came in. If you are a newly incorporated company and doing manufacturing sector, you can straight away start with 25. And if it's specified production activity, then you can go up 15%. So the tax rate can be as low as 50% of that of a partnership entity if they are doing the same business. They are manufacturing any article or thing which is as per the schedule given as per Income Tax Act. Then to that extent, you are getting a tax reduction of 15% if you start as a company when compared to the same thing started as a partnership. So that is how the differentiation happens. Other than all this, last year we had an ordinance which came in October 2019, which was again enacted subsequently. As per that ordinance, what happened was we had a huge drop in rate of the taxation. The domestic companies had an option to choose the rate of tax of 22% as compared to 30 which they were paying earlier, or 25 which they were paying earlier. So the only difficulty in many terms would be that you are not eligible for an additional depreciation. Anyway, additional depreciation does not create such a huge difference. Why? Because predominantly it's only a time value difference. So if I'm not eligible for an additional depreciation this year, I'm going to get that benefit in the subsequent years. So that's the only change that we need to look at. And other than that, obviously they said no deductions will be allowed. Many of them, if they were not keenly investing on any deduction schemes on activity, obviously that also will not be much of a difficulty. They also came up with an option saying that you will not be eligible to take the MAT credit which is being carried forward, as well as the unabsorbed depreciation which has been brought in. So considering these, other than that, they are given some certain other conditions. These are the primary conditions which is applicable to majority of them. If you are not an entity which is looking keenly on these areas, you could straight away take up 22%. And to majority of the corporates, this came as a really a big boom, because they had substantial funds on hand, which was savings as such, which was paid as tax earlier, which became a savings in the hands of the organization, which they could plan. Obviously, all this before pandemic. Post-pandemic, many situations have changed. We don't know how many entities will still have the same numbers. But yes, it still is a beneficial value when we compare as a tax rate, when we compare this versus the partnership and LLPs. Other than this, when you look at the deductions on other allowable expenditure, obviously companies get certain additional benefits, which is there in various provisions of the Act. Section 32 AC, which says if it's a uniformed company manufacturing an article and things specified as per the schedule, then you get a 15% additional allowed deduction in terms of your assets which is being invested. Similarly, 35 CCD, which talks about some scientific research and development activity, you can go up to 150% till the last financial year, and from the current financial year, you are eligible for an additional 100. You are eligible for 100% as deduction. Is the same thing allowed under a partnership firm? We have to test it, because technically speaking, a partnership firm doing a specific activity like this, they will claim it only as a business expenditure. Obviously, now in the current financial year, a firm and a partnership, a company and a partnership will not have that much of a difference. Whereas still the last year we had a significant variance coming in terms of tax sheets. Then we also have deduction under section 35D, which is talking about the preliminary expenses. Many a times preliminary expenses, the income tax officer seems to be calculated capital nature and disallowing it and all. But under Companies Act, certain expenditures which are eligible can be taken as preliminary expenses, and it will be allowed as deduction over a period of 5 years. Earlier, again, and I still find in many companies which they come up for incorporation now, they still have a concept called as deferred expenditure. As per that means the preliminary expenses, they're deferring it over a period and claiming it in the same lines to that what was there under the Income Tax Act. Obviously, the accounting standards have said a strict no to that. Once your accounting standards have said no, that means to say you have to charge off the full extent of preliminary expenses in the year of incorporation itself. You cannot look at claiming it over a period of time, saying that the current year is a loss, so I don't want to increase the loss, so I can anyway carry forward. Anyway, it's not allowed as expenditure under income tax, so I will carry forward and claim the expenditure. All that is not possible strictly under the Companies Act. Whereas under the Income Tax Act, yes, you get the benefit over a period of 5 years. That is allowed under section 35D. So now that I started talking about the requirement of accounting standards and other things, I think I forgotten to put that in the slide. There is a mandatory accounting standard for a firm and LLP, no. Whereas for a company, yes, there is a mandatory accounting standards. As of now, we have 2 accounting standards for companies. One is the accounting standard rules, which is there, which is as per the accounting rules of 2007, which kept amended from there on. The second thing is about the Indian accounting standards, which has been looked into, which is predominantly in terms of the international standards, obviously. So looking at the convergence into the international structure, we couldn't move into IFRS, obviously, and then that being the case, we have formulated an Indian accounting standard, which is more or less the international requirements, and that's been looked into. And that becomes a fundamental base. You have to follow that for maintaining the books of accounts under the Companies Act. Okay, so that is one again difference which comes into the picture. Then the deduction under section 36(1)(9), which is about the family planning. Any company, they can give they get an additional reduction if they have incurred any expenditure in these lines. So other than this, under the Income Tax Act, obviously the partnership enjoys a particular benefit which the LLP or the companies may not be able to enjoy, which is the cash basis of accounting. The partnership entity can still maintain books of accounts under cash basis. I think many chartered accountants are still doing it. Our firm is still under cash basis of accounting. It gives us the ease of incurring the expenditure, claiming the expenditure as and when it's incurred, and offering the income as and when it comes. It's not necessarily that we have to offer the income once it is billed. Whereas when it comes to companies, the difficulty is there. You have to follow only accrual system of maintaining books of accounts. You are not allowed to follow a cash basis of system. And is that a major difficulty in maintaining? Answer is no, not much of a difficulty. Why? Because now GST came in. Earlier also service tax came in and gave us a good turn. Now GST also has given us the same twist. Irrespective of whether you follow a cash based of system for income tax purposes, GST is anyway on billing. So effectively, you are following something like you are paying out the taxes even though you have not collected the money. So that's how it is working under GST. Significantly, not much of a difficult structure, but yes, that is something that we need to look into. So with that, then going into the possible payouts and the other requirements. What's happening under a Partnership Act is that anything which is distributed post-tax in the hands of the partners in the profit sharing ratio obviously becomes an exempt income in the hands of the partners. So, and similarly, whatever is offered as remuneration to the partners or the interest to the partners is having an Mr. Mohammed has raised a hand. Chairman, do we take up questions right now, or do we take the questions towards the end? Hello. Can we take questions right now? Is it okay? I think there's a question which has come up from one of the members.
Sir,
Do you want to? Can we take the questions right now? As
yes,
and when
sir.
we go?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay. So I think one of them had a question.
Yeah, already a question in the chat box.
Yeah, 1 second.
Can you read it or should I read
Yeah,
it?
1 second. 1 second, sir. 1 second. Yes. Sir, as per section 464 of Companies Act, can't we have 100 partners in a firm? There seems to be no limit prescribed under the Partnership Act. Okay, to that direction, yes, sir. But what happens is the bigger the partnership, there is a restriction again which is placed. I don't think the Partnership Act specifies about the restriction, but but in a general constraint, when you're converting from partnership to a company and all, it gives a restriction of 20 and 50. So that's how it is being looked at. And many a times when a partnership act is viewed at, they always say the cap is to be looked at 20 for a partnership as a safer side. So that's how the 20 numbers actually seeped in. So that is one of the requirements of the numbers of maximum numbers in the partnership. I think one more person had a question. Can they also post the question? Mr. Mohammed or someone had raised his hand.
So members can write down or type the queries in the chat box.
Okay.
Yeah. So someone to ask, they can unmute and ask the questions as well.
So, Mr. Mohammed AP, are we looking at taking up the question right now?
Are you able to see the message of Mahmoud?
No, sir.
No, I am also not seeing.
But I saw his. I think he raised his hand.
Okay.
So we look at it. Even towards the end, we can take it up. Not an issue.
Okay.
So yeah. So I'm going back to my presentation.
So can I ask one question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please.
Yeah, regarding partnership, is it compulsory to get it regarding whether it's compulsory to get it registered in the case of partnership firm?
It is not mandatory, sir. Under the Partnership Act, it is not mandatory. The benefit of registering a partnership deed is that it gets documented and it has its own legal validity. So when it comes to suing a third party and other things, you can go as a partnership, registered partnership.
Okay.
If other than that, there is not much of a significance in registering a partnership.
So suppose I am not, mine is not a registered partnership firm. Can I sue against outsiders? Is there any limitation if we are not registering?
You have to do it only as a partner, sir. You cannot do it as a partnership firm. As a partner of the firm who has not been given the benefit, you go on that legal compliance. But the partnership firm cannot go. That's not the case with an LLP or a company. The company or the LLP can straight away go. If it's a registered partnership, yes, you can still go. But other than that, it may not be possible.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir.
So going back to my PPT. So what we are having is the possibility of payouts in a partnership firm. What happens is, as I told you, the partnership firm gets taxed at 30%. Obviously, after the interest and remuneration. To that extent, the interest and remuneration is taxable in the hands of the partners, and the profit share, post-tax profit share, which is distributed, that is completely exempt in the hands of the partners. Under Companies Act, what happens is very similarly, the remuneration, whatever is paid to the directors, who could also be the shareholders of the organization, they are taxed in terms of salary. Whereas when it comes to the interest, again, it is taxable. The dividend that they get till last year was exempt under Section 1034. Last year, I mean to say, till 31st March 2020. Is exempt in the hands of the shareholders. Post-tax dividend which is paid out is exempt in the hands of the shareholders, but there is a cap fixed. Section 115 BBDA said if you are receiving remuneration dividend which is more than 10 lakhs aggregate from all the shares held by you, then to that extent beyond 10 lakhs is taxable at 10%. And this finance budget, after the 2.5 hour long speech that we are supposed to hear, we came to understand that the dividend distribution tax is scrapped. So why the dividend was earlier exempt in the hands of the shareholders is that it was again there was a dividend distribution tax in the hands of the company. So the company paid already 30% tax. Then on the percentage they were supposed to declare as dividend, they again had to pay a tax. It was a 15% grossing up basis. So it actually ended up with around 20.56% as tax. So whatever is the amount which is to be paid, 20% will be paid as tax. Balance amount will be distributed to shareholders. So effectively on the on a taxed income, we were again paying another tax. So it was a higher value of tax which was already there. So considering all this budget, what happened is they have cleared out the concept, or they have given a different. They have said that no more dividend distribution tax will be there. It has been scrapped from 1st April to 2020. Post that, it's going to be only taxation in the hands of the shareholders. So now it has gone into the reverse. So post-tax, any amount which is distributable by company, there is no tax liability at all for the company. That is, if you are distributing any tax from 1st April 2020, then there won't be any tax which is required. Whereas when it comes to the hands of the shareholders, it becomes taxable from rupee 1. It becomes taxable under income from other sources from rupee 1. So how significant is this? It actually is the reverse. We thought, okay, now shareholders, many of them may be in the lower bracket structure, or they may be below the tax slabs. So this will enhance that the tax liability is not there. The company also gets the shield, saying that they need not pay the 20%. But it actually worked out to be the reverse, and especially when there are bigger corporates. And I'm looking at some, when I looked at certain numbers which were shared from Infosys, Wipro, and other people, the promoters holding, however small they were getting a substantial amount of dividend. And now that it is taxable in their personal hands, it straight away goes into the 30% slab. So once it goes into the 30% slab, the amount of difference that the government of India would be losing in terms of small shareholders is way too less, and they will actually gain significantly higher from these taxpayers. So that is how it has been looked into. So effectively, the scrapping of dividend distribution tax ended up in having a very high revenue for the government than having reduction in revenue in the hands of the government. But the only difference is, in terms of a dividend distribution tax, at the time of distribution itself, you are getting the revenue. Whereas in terms of the individuals, they'll have to pay only as per the 4 quarters of advance tax. There's no other change. So the income does not come in one single shot. It comes over a period. Whereas for dividend distribution tax, it was one single shot. So that was the change technically. But since that is again a taxable structure and other things, it is very costlier affair. So then the other option that companies can look out, and which is a very, very effective way of remunerating the shareholders, is Section 115 QA. This was earlier restricted only to private limited companies, closely held companies. Now it's let open to all, both listed and unlisted companies can take up this activity. What this indirectly says is, if you're having shares, then on sale of those shares or surrender of those shares, you're liable for a 20% capital gains. Okay, let's assume it's a long-term capital gains, then you are liable for a 20% capital gains, long-term capital gains, after the indexation benefit and other things. So now, there is an option for the companies to go and give an option called as buyback. In a buyback, what happens is that the company, because it's a legal entity by itself, buys its own shares. That means it tries to cancel its own shares by purchasing it from the shareholders. So once the shareholders surrender this particular value, then it becomes much more easier. So he has to pay a capital gains tax. So if this dividend distribution tax, if this buyback tax was not there, when the shareholder surrenders his shares, it becomes like a relinquishment of right over a share. It becomes a taxable event under capital gains. And once the capital gains is attracted, he pays 20% tax. Now, if it comes under dividend buyback tax, the company pays the 20% and it becomes exempt in the hands of the shareholders under Section 1034A. So that being the structure, there is no tax liability. The post-tax income which is received by the shareholders is technically not taxable in his hands. Effectively, the tax has been paid by the company. So this is one structure that we can look at in terms of remunerating the shareholders. Again, provided this is a very useful structure if the company is actually doing really well. So the only hiccup in a buyback is you cannot do a buyback every now and then. You should have at least 12 months gap between 2 buybacks. That is the only thing. So every year you can have 1 buyback. Every 12 months frame you can have 1 buyback. So what happens is when you are doing a buyback, obviously the share capital comes down. So the balance sheet looks a very healthy balance sheet. The assets are still there. The share capital is low, whereas the company is still having substantial assets. So it becomes a healthy balance sheet. But how frequently can this pay out? That means you cannot wipe out the complete share capital. You cannot make share capital as 0 at any point of time. So that being the structure, your paid up share capital can be reduced only to the extent of 25% every year. That's the limit which has been given. So every time when we have been using this buyback tax for last 4 years at present, what happens is 1 year we'll give a buyback, next year we'll give a bonus share. So we will recoup the share. If the company is doing really well and there's a good amount of reserves every year, then what we do is instead of giving a dividend tax, we actually pay it out as an dividend. We actually pay it out as a buyback. We ensure that you buy back 1 year, next year we go for a bonus issue, recoup the share capital. The 3rd year again we go for buyback. So in that way, what happens is whatever is the reserves which is there, that is only pulled out in terms of the shareholders. And it actually works out very effective, cost effective, because if you are paying dividend and 115 BBDA kept a cap of 10 lakhs. So anything beyond 10 lakhs is anyway taxable at 10%. So what happens is you are paying tax at 20% for dividend distribution plus 10% in the hands of the shareholders. So effectively 30% is getting taxed. Whereas when you go under a buyback structure, you effectively had to pay only 20% as tax. So it became a very good tax planning methodology, provided you could meet all the statutory compliances. So that's how the whole structure worked out. So even now, we still prefer an buyback as an option over dividend, for the simple reason that it anyway, and if something has to be paid as tax, 20% or 30% is getting taxed. We try to plan it out in such a way that it is restricted to 20. So that's how we look at the structuring of a payment of tax goes. So these are some of the tax benefits which we have to look into. Other than this, under Income Tax Act, the benefits which has been given to corporates, some benefits which is given to private partnership firms and other things, there is no significant difference in any other entity, any other law. That means to say, if it's a provident fund or ESI or GST or any other statutory laws that is to be looked into, there is no special benefit that a partnership enjoys over income over Companies Act or LLP. So that being the case, it is much more easier if you can structure your requirements of the person who's investing. Then it becomes much more easier to determine whether it's easier to go as partnership or as company. Excuse me. Sorry. So that's what is the requirement here. So once you incorporate an organization, the compliance of statute becomes a very important activity. And once you are looking at a company, then the coverage of the statute is also responsibility of the auditors. We already know that the auditing standards are there, wherein it says that we have to ensure that all the required statutory compliances has been met by the company. So an organization which is under a Companies Act, being audited by a chartered accountant like us, gives a better benefit than an partnership firm which is audited only for the restricted purpose of tax computations. So that's how the benefits come in. So looking at other things, I've just highlighted some of the forms which is needed to be filed at ROC level. Obviously, there are quite a few forms which may need to be filed, but not all companies are required to file all forms. These are minimum forms which we may need to be filed. One is your annual return, which is AOC 4, which comes into picture, which is the filing of the financial statements with ROC. Technically, it's happening within 30 days from the end of the AGM, 30 days from the end of the AGM. Again, AGM predominantly is supposed to happen by 30th of September. So that's why 30th September became a very, very important day for Chartered Accountants. It became the 30th September for AGMs, 30th September for GST, any rectification, 30th September is the date. Earlier, the income tax return was 30th September. Now, it has been pushed to October. And now for this year, it's further pushed by one more month to November. For any other requirements like FEMA things, 180 days from the end of the financial year is given. So technically, September 30th became a very, very crucial date for all of us. Even your income tax hearing closure and all, 30th September is the due date right now for the current year. So September month was always planned as a tragic month. So when I was planning to get married, my senior partner suggested that you should not get married in September. You should not get married in June or July. Okay, all these 3 months you leave. Other than these 3 months, you decide on a date, is what he said. Because that's how we slog predominantly. So that being the structure, September is a very important month for all of us. So AOC 4 again it has to be filed with 30 days from the end of the AGM. Okay, please remember that AGM is a mandatory meeting to be conducted by the company, and it is mandated that every chartered accountant, every auditor has to be physically present in the AGM. Please be aware of this. Unfortunately or fortunately, people are not aware of this particular function. Section 146 is very, very clear in the terms. Companies Act 146. It says that it is mandatory that every auditor should be present in the annual general meeting, either by himself or through his representative. The representative should also be a chartered accountant, is what it says. If you're not attending the meeting, then to that extent, you can take a permission. You have to apply for the permission to the company. Take it much ahead of time before the AGM happens. Okay, so please remember this clause. Why I'm stressing on this particular activity is that many of us, 30th September is the AGM day. Okay, for all the private limited companies that most of the chartered accountants say, 30th September is the AGM day. So for all the companies that he is signing, 30th will be the AGM. He will back work some days and arrive at the board meeting date. Okay. Again, that board meeting date could not be gone back drastically because of the introduction of UDIN. Okay, so UDIN gave one cap saying that you cannot go beyond 30 days. So that cap obviously came in. So people were technically going back to a major extent. But now you must also remember that if you have companies in different districts or different places in one state, and all the AGMs are conducted on 30th of September, it is not practically possible for you to be available in all cases. For example, I am an auditor for 5 companies, 3 companies in Kozhikode, 1 company in Cochin, 1 company in Trivandrum. For all the companies, definitely I cannot have a board meeting on AGM on 30th. It is not possible for me to attend all the AGMs. And generally, how the AGM timing will be fixed is 10 to 10:30 company A, 10:30 to 11 o'clock company B, 11 to 11:30 company C. Like that, they will formulate. And they are the only ones who are filing the information also. So since you don't give even a time frame of half a minute between one AGM to other AGM, it is not practically possible for the auditor to attend all these AGMs. So please plan accordingly, and all these are getting documented. Okay, it is easy for ROC or anyone to pull us up, because all these are numbers or data which we ourselves have given to the department. Okay, the membership number of the chartered accountant signing is going under AOC 4. So technically speaking, they know who is the member. They also know who when is the AGM. So if on the same day, same member is supposed to be present in 6 different cities at the same time, it is not possible. Okay, so it's easy to capture, it's easy to penalize nowadays because of the information that we are submitting. So please be aware. So the first form that I wanted to discuss is on AOC 4, which talks about the annual return kind of a structure, which has to be filed. One common form which most of the companies forget to file is CHG1 and CHG4, which is charge creation and satisfaction of charge. Obviously, if it's taken from any nationalized banks or private sector banks, they themselves come up and say, please file the forms, because the bank manager is also mandated to sign the form. So that being the case, they themselves come up and ask us to file. But many times people forget to file this form, and there is penalty attached to all this also. So please look into it. What's the time frame available? Technically, you should file it within 30 days of creation, modification, or 30 days from satisfaction. So that's how it's the time frame which is available. So any entity which is forming. Then we have the new forms which came up last year, which is DAR3, KYC complaint for directors. Generally, it's to be done by 30th of April. Now this year, due to COVID, we have all forms which has to be filed has been deferred till 30th of September without any penalty, without any additional fee. But other than that, every year you have to file the DAR3. Obviously, if there's no change, it's a very simple process. You just need to go say no change, and then file the form. If there are changes in the forms, then to that extent, you have to file the details of the change and give the supporting documentation to that extent. So that is again a form. Last year, I'm sure all of us had a very, very difficult time with DAR3. We didn't know how to go. Then we had to take the picture. Photo had to be uploaded. So many requirements. First DAR form, then the annual form, so many requirements came in. So I'm sure all of us are experienced in that. But as of now, DAR3, again, please don't forget to file this form. MGT 14, wherever there is a requirement of filing a resolution under section 117, 117 has a specific 10 to 11 items which are mentioned. If you are doing anything in that 11 items, then you're supposed to file MGT 14 for a private limited company. Again, within how many days? 30 days from passing that agreement, you're supposed to file. The other forms which again last year we had a huge commotion is DPT3. I'm sure the last year we had to file two forms. One annual form DPT3. The other form is an yearly one is an annual form, then is a one-time form. Two forms we had to file for DPT3. Please take care of this DPT3 again. DPT3 becomes a very important information since it is capturing many information like what are all deposits, what is not considered as deposits, what's not considered as public deposits, what is there as capital advances. There's so many information which is getting captured. Please be very specific on it. I'll take one or two questions which has come up right now. One question is on AGM which has come, which says that in case of AGM, will the auditor be in default if notice of AGM or communication in this regard is not received? Auditor is not in default, sir, but the company will be in default. But once you are aware that there is a requirement of to attend an AGM, there's a notice which has been served on the auditor, he must be present. If he is not present, then it becomes a violation from the auditor's point of view. If he is not appearing for the AGM, then it becomes a violation of the auditor. But serving of notice is the requirement of the company. Then one more question. Is there any prescribed procedures for getting the word India in the name of partnership firm? Yeah, I have tried it for companies, I have not tried it for firms. So unfortunately, I don't think I will be the right person to answer that. But I don't think that's if you are registering the firm. Yeah, if you're registering the firm, yes, then I think you have to take the you have to go with the requirements with the registrar. I don't think otherwise there would be a requirement to look into. So these are the two things, right? Okay. Then I'll come back to the remaining. So yeah, coming back to DAR3. DPT3. Please be very, very clear. One very, very careful thing that we all have to be when it comes to partnership, when it comes to companies, is that all the information is submitted by us. So that's not the case only with ROC. The same thing happens with GST. Same thing happens with income tax also these days. There is so much of data which the department has. I've always said this in all my meetings wherever I can get an opportunity to give this as an example. I always give this. I had quite a few discussions with various assisting officers, assistant commissioners, commissioners of income tax, and all. And when I was talking to them, they were very keen on GST returns, very keen on ROC returns, and all. So when I said, "Sir, why are you so very keen on so many returns?" He says, "Sir, the data which is there in that return is very, very useful for me for my return." For example, they gave an example in terms of your HSN summary, HSN SAC summary, which is actually which is to be given under GSTR 9. Obviously, for 17, 18, 19 financial years, it's not mandatory. But after that, it will become mandatory. But technically, when I asked why are they keen on this summary, he said, "Sir, you have to give inputs, HSN and SAC summary. If you give an SAC summary in your inputs, that means it is a service. Then I know which party. I will take the party list from the SAC summary in GSTR 9, and I will cross-check whether that party has been for the same PAN. GST anyway has the PAN. I will check whether that PAN is reflected in your 26Q. If it's reflected in 26Q and it's almost for the same value, I will not be bothered much about it. But if it's not reflected or the value is lower, then straight away I can send a notice to you. I will send two notices. One is from the DDS wing, one from the assessment wing. Okay, so both things I will send notices. Not only here, I will also inform the GST department. They will also send a cross referencing, because they will check whether that person has offered this as a GST income or not. So to that extent, there is data analytics which is possible. It's a simple Excel tool they need to use to just consolidate the numbers and cross-check whether the payment of taxes has happened across and all. Similarly for ROC, there's a form which is called MSME form. I think I'll be talking about it in the next slide. MSME forms are there. This DPT3 form is there, wherein very clearly we are giving some information. Okay, for example, in DPT3, we are saying that we have taken some capital advances, which is not covered as deposits. So very clearly, it becomes an transaction. Then they will test whether this is liable for capital gains under Income Tax Act, whether the advance is significant, whether it's to be closed, not closed, whether capital gains is applicable, not applicable. It can be tested there. Okay. Similarly, in terms of GST returns, okay, your turnover here versus your turnover in GST can be easily cross-checked. It's not that difficult to cross-check the transaction. Anyway, now under GST or 9, when we are filing the return, we obviously mention that whether it is paired to the financials or not. If a person is having multiple GSTNs, then to that extent, all GSTNs together should ensure that the turnover matches. So these kind of structures are anyway difficulties anyway there. So that being the structure, it is very, very easy for the departments to pull in the data. This is not which will happen in the past. I had a personal experience with service tax department. Okay, this happened around 6 years prior to now, when the service tax annual return information was taken by the income tax department, and they compared the return, the income offered under service tax vis-a-vis the income offered under GST, under Income Tax Act, and raised a query as to why we have offered a lower income. Obviously, under service tax, certain things are to be paid as under RC. Okay, they didn't consider that. Because of all that, they said there's an income which has escaped assessment. Section 148 notice came in for us. It was not even a 143 assessment, it was a 148 notice which came in based on this kind of a transaction. So the amount of information which is available with ROC, with the GST department, with Income Tax department and all, is quite a substantial value. If they want, they can look at it very, very seriously. Fortunately or unfortunately, till now, they have not concentrated too much. Obviously, many income tax assessments, the department comes up and says, give us the VAT returns or the GST returns and all to cross-check. But other than at the time of assessments, they don't do. But they need not happen at the time of assessments. I'm sure most of you under 143 these days, intimation, you are getting one query sheet upfront. If there is any disallowances which is proposed under 3CD and the same disallowance is not happened or made by the company, obviously they raise one query, and obviously whatever reply you give, they don't consider the reply and they process under 143 and give it to you. Okay, so these kind of analytical activity can happen from the department's point of view. So we must be very, very clear on what information we are giving. Okay, if you give some information here, and if you don't give the corresponding information in 2 or 3 other places, definitely you will get the credit. For example, DPT3 here, you are saying that you have not paid a creditor for more than 180 days. Okay. You've taken advance from a particular person for more than 365 days, but it's not considered deposits. Then obviously, whether that person has shown it in this return, whether it's liable for interest or not, that and all gets picked up. Similarly, when you go to the next form called MSME form, okay, this MSME form captures information of all payments paid beyond 45 days to an MSME. Okay, micro, small, and medium enterprise. And for all positive reasons, MSME is the core concentration for Government of India. So now that they are concentrating on MSME, so if you say I have paid beyond 45 days under MSME form, then obviously under MSME Act of 2006, you are supposed to create an interest provision as an interest. Once you create a provision as interest, the same thing has to be disallowed under Income Tax Act. If you don't disallow under Income Tax Act, but you file an MSME form, straight away Income Tax Department can raise a notice. So there are so many cross-referencing which can happen between the forms which you file for ROC versus your Income Tax Act versus your GST. So does it mean that partnership firm is the most apt version to go ahead? No, you have to take a call. You have to take a reasonable call on what is the need of the art. Okay, so the next form is I think I've come back to the forms is MSME form. It is an half-yearly form. 2 forms have to be filed, one by 30th of April, other by 31st of October. If there is any payments made beyond 45 days, then you have to mention the party and the amount due in this particular column, in this particular form. And once this form is filed, auditors, please remember that we have to create a provision as per MSME Act, and the same provision has to be disallowed under Income Tax Act also. So that is something we have to look into. Then we have other form that we may need to be filed is ADT1, which is the appointment of auditors. 1, 2, 3, 4 is there, but I'm restricting myself to 1, which is the appointment of auditors requirement. So these are all some of the forms that needs to be filed for ROC purposes. I'm not talking about all the forms due to want of time. Coming towards the last part of my presentation. So how do we select how to go, whether it's to be a partnership? If a client comes in and says which is the most appropriate niche entity which is for him in terms of creation, whether it's a sole proprietorship or partnership or LLP or a company, then probably we have to look at I've just put 5 of what I felt as the main activity. These 5 are only indicative in nature, but once you know that these 5, then you can easily determine. One is the nature of business. When you're talking about nature of business, we are saying what will be the scale of the business, what is going to be the impact of it, whether it is going to have a small activity or it's going to look at the bigger activity, whether there are going to be a lot of branches. These kind of activities will be the first kind of consideration. Next is the commitment cost. If the person does not want to block his money predominantly as capital commitment, as a capital cost, then obviously we can look at having as a lower private limited company with a small paid up share capital. The balance amount can be given as loan to the entity. Whereas in a partnership, we will have to invest the whole thing as capital. You can give loan also, but all said and done, most of them would prefer to keep it as a capital. The banks will not treat the loan taken from the partner as an separate capital contribution itself. They will only treat it as a loan, and hence it will not be given a higher valuation. Whereas in terms of a company, if the loan is given by the shareholders, you can still give a declaration saying that the money will not be pulled out till the bank loan is settled. They still give that as a higher weightage to the other entity. So capital commitment cost is something that we need to look into. Number of members, again, yes, that is something. If you are looking at, I would prefer anything more than 20, even though we have discussed whether there's more number limits given under Partnership Act. Anything more than 20 means I would prefer to go under an LLP. Anything less than 20, we can still go under a partnership or and anyway, irrespective of the number, if it's more than 2, company is always a legal form which takes a role for me. It's always gives a comfort zone for me. So number of members also plays a significant role. Size of operation, obviously, which looks at where are the operations, what are going to be the activities to be done, how much will be the time spent, manpower required, all those kind of structures also will be looked into. And last thing is statutory requirements. By statutory requirements, I'm saying that if there's any foreign money coming in, or if there's any other significant activity by which they are insisting that it should be only a company which has to be formulated, those kind of structures, we can still look at statutory requirements based on which we decide on what is to be the entity which has to be created. So, what's the time?